Cuba, a land of struggle, a land of sacrifice. Cuba, a place where the slogan, homeland or death, built a proud new nation. Cuba, home to Assata Shakur and Guillermo Morales, our own freedom fighters. Assata Shakur, previously known as Joanne Chesmar, was held and tortured in the U.S. prison system as a captured member of the Black Liberation Army. Upon her liberation from prison on November 2, 1979, she was granted political asylum in Cuba, where she now resides. William Guillermo Morales, alleged leader of the FALN, was captured, sentenced, and tortured in a U.S. prison in July of 1978. Vowing he would not be in prison long, he escaped and was later recaptured and tortured in Mexico, once again on May 26, 1983. Due to the Mexican people's history of solidarity with the Puerto Rican independence movement and the tremendous international pressure, Guillermo was allowed to fly to Cuba, where he received political asylum. Last year, the Lexington Control Unit for Women, which had 3 political prisoners in it, was closed down after a District of Columbia judge declared that the prison violated the human rights of the prisoners. Why do you think this brutalization of women in the control units, up to and including rape, is becoming so common?
I think that the brutalization of women, especially women political prisoners, is a result of the fact that women are becoming more active, more vocal, and as women are becoming more active and more vocal, they look to women for leadership. They look to women for examples, and that these women are examples to women who say, I'd like to struggle, and who would look toward a Alejandrina Torres as a role model, as someone they could say, you know, I'd like to be like her. This is a woman who's principled. This is a woman who stands up. They would look to a woman like Susan Rosenberg and say, this woman has taken principled stands against oppression, and I'd like to be like her. And what the government is doing now is setting up prisons that are more and more repressive, trying to set up control units that are more and more repressive, where they create a situation where you have people living in a state of torture, 24-hour-a-day torture, with no recreation, no human contact, no fresh air, no contact with other human beings, that they do everything in their capability to try to remove that person from a normal human environment. And that it's not, I mean, it's not just imprisonment, it's imprisonment with a vengeance. And I think that we have to really struggle to close down all of these units that are really torture units, and to expose the viciousness with which people are confronted. People, for example, in Marion, you have a bed that's a concrete slab with 4 rings on it, rings to tie people's hands down and tie their feet down. I mean, that is inhumane under anybody's standards, but that exists. Marion is inhumane under anybody's standards. To keep someone in a cage for 23 and a half hours a day is inhumane under anybody's standards. But that's going on, and that we have to just pool our resources to fight against the Marions, because it's not just one Marion, it's a whole nation of Marions that's cropping up.
Look, there are some people who will say, well, I can support prisoners of conscience, sort of like Amnesty International does, but then they ask, how can I support people like Matulu Shakur or Tommy Manning, who are convicted of killing policemen and who have used violence and bombed things. How can I support that?
You have to understand that the American system, the American capitalist system, as we know it, is built on violence. And all types of violence, from sexual violence to racial violence, and economic violence, okay? The American justice system is a violent organization. We just have to look at the American jail system and see how violent the American judicial system is. The American economic system is violent. What happens when workers go on strike? Don't they use the police against workers to beat their heads in and make them go back to work and break those strikes so they can go back and keep making millions of dollars worth of profits for the American capitalist system? What happened in '68? Didn't they assassinate a peace-loving man like Martin Luther King? Here's a man who only marched. He never threw a bomb. He never used a gun. He was assassinated. Why? Because he represented. It got to a point that he represented the conscience, not only of Black America. He was becoming the conscience of all those who are being oppressed within the United States, including that all these actions that have been taken, that have been carried out by guerrilla groups and armed groups and organizations is justified within that context. Not only that, international law gives us that right to fight against colonialism and to fight against injustice. And they have to understand, whatever step they take in the name of justice, the United States will take steps to create that injustice and to keep that injustice that still exists.
Recently, in February, Nelson Mandela was released and welcomed by millions of people in the United States as a political prisoner who had spent about 26 years in prison. In the United States, we have political prisoners who have spent up to 20 years in prison. Why do you think it is that people can support the Nelson Mandelas outside of the United States, but cannot or will not support freedom fighters inside the United States?
You have a lot of people within the United States that support popular causes outside the United States. Okay? That is positive. I'm not knocking it. It's good that they support causes outside the United States. But many of these people refuse to support causes within the United States because they are simply afraid, or simply they still carry that racist character that they have. Okay? It's popular, it's cliche, it's in fashion to support, let's say, like you say, Mandela, Nicaragua, El Salvador.
The question, the reason that people will support a Nelson Mandela is because there's been a whole movement in South Africa, a whole movement that's been building, that's been talking about political prisoners, that's been insisting on the legitimacy of that movement, that's been insisting on the liberation of political prisoners, and insisting that the government is the criminal and not those who are fighting against the criminal policies of that government. And we have to do the same thing, because our movement was virtually destroyed on many levels in the 1970s as a result of government repression. The government criminalized our movement in the same way that the government is criminalizing our people. Is saying that, you know, for example, in the 1960s, the Black Panther Party was portrayed by the media as these crazy criminals, these kind of anarchistic black folks that were just wild and crazy. And that, I mean, there was never a balanced picture in terms of what the Black Panther Party was about, so that what people every day saw was these crazy panthers with guns, and that was the image, that you have a panther, you have a gun, and you have a criminal element. And as time went by, those Panthers were accused of, in many instances, crimes which they were innocent of. They were framed, they were sent to prison for either conspiracy cases, for false, just trumped up criminal charges, and off the face of the earth, out of the movement, out of the center of struggle. And the movement was, you know, the leaders were just chipped away, head by head. I mean, they just knocked people's heads off in one way, literally, in the case of Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, or they put people behind bars. And it weakened our movement, but it also criminalized our movement.
There are some prisoners like Sekou Odinga, Tim Blunt, Sundiata Acoli, who are constantly in places like Marion, who are put into the box, often denied visits, unable to touch their children or wives. But yet these prisoners keep their spirits. They write out articles and messages on an ongoing basis. Whereforth comes this strength, this tenacity, if you will?
The U.S. government knew what they were doing when they put Sundiata Acoli into prison. They knew what they were doing when they put Sekou Odinga in prison. They knew what they were doing when they put Sylvia Baraldini in prison, because they were taking some of our most dedicated, some of our most committed, some of our most intense revolutionaries from our midst and locking them up so that they cannot do the work that needs to be done. In the case of Sundiata, we were on trial together. I mean, his humanness, his decency, his calm, his kind of love kept me together. I mean, and through all the time that I've known Sundiata, you know, all that beauty has always shined through. I mean, you know, he's always managed a way to give. I mean, you know, lawyers would come in and tell him their problems, you know, and he would always give advice, show his concern, ask about their kids, ask about, you know, just the day-to-day problems that they had.
What are some of the major cases that you think we need to work on?
In the case of Geronimo Pratt, Geronimo's been in prison about 20 years, and in Geronimo's case, it's ludicrous. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. The fact that Geronimo has been in prison 20 years, 7 of that 20 years was spent in solitary confinement. Everything was done to break him. Everything was done to destroy him. And that there are government informers, FBI informers, who say that Geronimo was framed, that Geronimo is innocent, that the government itself admits that that number one, there was a government agent in his defense team, all this kind of stuff. I mean, so that it's just the fact that he's in prison today speaks to our duty, to our absolute responsibility to struggle on behalf of political prisoners, because you know, I mean, his case is just so blatant, just so obvious, just, I mean, there are mountains and mountains and mountains of documents that prove that he was a victim of COINTELPRO, but the man is still in prison. The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal is a case where the government is trying to kill a revolutionary, trying to literally take his life and put him into the electric chair. And we cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow that to happen because it's the case of a human being's life, a human being who has struggled, who has dedicated his life to the liberation of his people. But also we cannot allow that to happen because it will set a precedent. And if we do not struggle tooth and nail to keep the state from killing him, then we are allowing a situation to happen where the government can accuse any of us of any crime and put us to death without any mass movement, without even having to take into consideration that there will be hell to pay if you try to kill our revolutionaries. And I think that's really important, because if we allow the government to kill him, we will be sentencing so many of our youth to death. Another case that it is extremely important for people to rally around and support is the case of Alan Berkman. Alan Berkman is only alive because he's a doctor and because he diagnosed himself and insisted on a medical examination. He has Hopkins disease, and his very life is being threatened by the absolute refusal of the prison authorities and the government to provide him with adequate medical treatment. So that is another very important case for people to support.
In 1988, a broad coalition of us came together to form a coalition called Freedom Now, to internationalize the struggle of free political prisoners and prisoners of war. And in December of 1990, there will be a tribunal in New York City in which international jurists will come and raise the question of human rights abuses in the United States. What do you think about this?
Well, I think a tribunal of that sort will be very significant, not only to the struggle inside the United States, but also internationally, because I think that much more needs to be known out here in the world about what is going on in the United States, because the United States government always projects this image throughout the world that it is a champion of human rights. And the reality of that situation is that the United States is the biggest violator of human rights, not only in the United States, but all over the world.
If this is done, this will create this will be a major victory on an international level. Not only that, I think this can be the basis for more unity within the different third world and progressive organizations in the United States, which is very important, because I also think that there has to be more unity between us. There's been so much disunity that was created by the United States government, okay, with all these programs that they created. But I think that working towards the liberation of political prisoners and prisoners of war is also the basis for unity among all these organizations. And not should we be unified to only free our comrades here in jail, but we should be unified towards liberating all of our people that live in the United States also.
We have a situation where there are more than 100 political prisoners and prisoners of war, and so I think that it's really important for people to see that and to understand that these people are in prison because they have struggled, and that it is important to struggle to free them, because they have given their freedom, their time, their sweat, their blood to struggle for the freedom of oppressed people, and that as oppressed people, it is our job to struggle to support them and to struggle for their liberation.
In the last month, the government of Zimbabwe has offered political refuge status to Matulu Shakur. And then we have you and Guillermo Morales, who have been given political asylum in Cuba. And recently, the Italian parliament has demanded the release and extradition of Silvio Berardini according to a U.S.-Italian treaty. What is the significance of these international overtures, and what could be the impact in the international arena?
Well, I think that what this shows is that, you know, there are many governments, especially revolutionary governments, that are not duped by the posturing and the hypocritical stances that the United States government is taking and has historically taken. I think that it's very important that even a government like Italy has been willing to accept Silvia Berardini as a political prisoner and is offering, you know, for her to go there. What is holding it up, as far as I understand, is the United States government. I think that this is very important, and I think that more and more, as time goes on, many more governments will be willing to accept political prisoners and to take principal positions around political prisoners.